we're learning more and more every day about the Reform Party and the bigotry and racism. It's horrible. And yet, have you heard a squeak from Sunak? A proper British Prime Minister would have denounced Farage by now and said, this is unacceptable. Our country will never wear this. This is un-British. And Starmer's been pathetic. It has to be fought. This is the battle of our lifetime. Look what's happening in France. Look what's happening in Germany. It's not going to happen in my Britain. And he'd single out Farage, the unacceptable face of British politics. You've had nothing from either Starmer or Sunak in this general election.
Britain's Conservative Party is the most successful political organisation in the Western world. Ever. For the best part of 2 centuries, it has been the default party of government in the UK. It's the equivalent in British politics of Real Madrid. It is, historically speaking anyway, addicted to winning. But that might be about to change. There's a general election here in the UK in July, and if the polling is to be believed, then the Conservatives are in line for a historic hiding. Some polls put them below 20%. Some polls even put Reform, led by Nigel Farage, ahead of them. So on the ballot in July isn't just a candidate or a set of policies or a manifesto or even a potential prime minister, but a whole ideology, a whole tradition and history, a whole way of doing politics. In short, British conservatism is at a crossroad. And some people think that means that this election is the most important, perhaps for a century. After all, it's not very often that one of the major parties collapses. We've seen it once before with the Liberals a century ago. Could we see it happen once more in July? Well, today's guest thinks that's a distinct possibility, and he should know. After all, he is a Conservative with real pedigree to match. Peter Oborne is a former political editor at The Spectator and a former chief political commentator at The Telegraph, and he thinks that the Conservative Party isn't just headed for collapse, but it's about to be replaced by something very different. Peter Oborne, welcome to Downstream.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
We've wanted to get you on for a very long time because you've been saying very interesting things about the Conservative Party for a very long time. And for a very long time, you're a bit of a siren voice who may have been interpreted as being wide of the mark because you were saying there are big problems in the Conservative Party, but of course electorally they were flying high. Now they're not. How do they go from this high watermark of 2019, incredible performance, to where they are today, regularly polling below 20%?
It's a longish story, but you have to start before 2009, the election. It was what happened in the summer when, provoked by Dominic Cummings, Boris Johnson effectively split the Tory party between he got rid of the so-called One Nation wing of the Tory party in, I think it was early August, and the traditional Tory party, the Ken Clarke, the Rory Stewart, the Dominic Grieve, the Gawke. And after that, it was a beautiful analogy, I forget who'd made it, the Tory party flies on 2 wings, which balance each other. And thereafter, the Tory party was flying on 1 wing, and it was doomed to crash. And it duly has. I mean, I do think it's going to be the worst result the Tory party has ever had. And I think it may well be the end of the Conservative Party. If you analyse what has happened. So in 2019, they brought in a load of MPs who you will have noticed there's been a large number of personal catastrophes, people who've behaved in either been fraudulent or caught up in wretched dealing or ignored public standards and had to leave or been stripped of the whip. And there was one scandal after another. This is because the usual sort of methods were abandoned. If you look at who Boris Johnson brought in as his party chairman, was just some sort of financial fixer with public PR man who fixed stuff. He didn't know anything about politics. They knew about how to get money. And I don't actually think now that it's retrievable. I think it's very unlikely that the Conservative Party, as it existed from 18, let's say you can see it arriving in, starting to take proper modern form after the first reform, and then as it's carried on until, the early 21st century, I think that's gone.
So we're looking at almost 200 years of history down the drain.
Well, life moves on, doesn't it? I mean, but I think that it was the greatest and most successful political party in the Western world over the last 200 years. People writing this is how you can save it. I'm not sure you can. I think it's, doomed, but partly because you can't see any figures of any caliber joining it now, and they're not left. They were kicked out, and who's going to bring back? What's going to incentivize Rory Stewart to come back into it? Or the next Ken Clarke, or I think that, and you can see what's going to happen to it in the short term. That it has already been to a very large extent captured by the far right, and there's going to be a battle for it in the next, after the election.
Well, Tim Montgomery blamed a procession of what he called Napoleonic leaders, which is to say there's nothing wrong with the institution. It's just so happens that several bad leaders have been at the top, and if that hadn't happened, this could have been avoided. But from the sounds of it, you're saying something quite. That's
a very shallow analysis, because what produces these bad leaders, and you have to look at the structures which produce those leaders. And it's a story which is connected with movements in society, which is the collapse of civil society, the public realm. And the Tory party is a manifestation of that in certain ways. You can see it being captured by big finance money. It used to have enormous. It stretched beautifully out across the country as a whole to the institution, Women's Institute, these small C conservative organisations. It reflected the writing, the analysis of Oakeshott, the great conservative philosopher. There are very few conservative philosophers or political thinkers of great moment, and it was really it's Burke and Oakeshott. And Oakeshott's great insight was that politics didn't matter very much, or shouldn't matter very much, that most people wanted to get on with the ordinary business of their lives, whether it's running a school or training a racehorse, which he was fond of, or playing a role in your local community, pursuing your own objectives. But you need, in order for all that to go on, you need to have a party which keeps out of ordinary life. And it has been captured by a collection of people who want to use politics to make money. And that's what Johnson was the most egregious example of this. So he encouraged a culture where very rich men wanted access to the Conservative Party in order to sell their products or get secure soft regulation for their businesses, and to get contracts, secure social position. I mean, whatever it was, and suddenly it lost this connection, this deep, profound, centuries-old connection with society as a whole.
Is that? I'm not suggesting you're saying it's new, but how new is it when you look at somebody like, I believe it was Lord Feldman, was alongside David Cameron, and he was very much, he was his partner in crime, and I think he becomes the chair of the party in 2005-06.
Lord Feldman, I don't want to say anything.
And he brings huge amounts of money into the party.
Yeah. Now, look, this is true that, and I don't want to suggest that Lord Feldman did anything remotely improper, but he does. There was a trend towards this, the financialisation of British politics, going back not all that far, but it went back. It begins in the Thatcher era. Tony Blair did a lot because in order to eliminate the trade unions as a source of political power and influence, he set up his private fund. You may remember. Quite disgusting in my view, just immorally disgusting, because politics is really about serving the common good. It's not enabling the interests of a small collection of people who can buy it. And Blair did that, and it was hailed as a brilliant innovation. Actually, it was a disaster for British politics. Cameron then tried to copy Blair, so he'd seen somebody called Lord Levy do this for Blair, and he brought in figures such as Feldman, and all they. I'm not blaming people like Feldman, but they don't bring any rich understanding of political traditions or the importance of association and so forth. They see their job as to bring in money, which they do well, but you have to look at the motives. And huge sums of people who invest huge sums of money into the British politics are looking for a return. They're not doing it out of the goodness of their heart.
And was there a moment in the last few years for you where you thought, actually, decimation is coming? Not like, Labour get a poor result in 2019, they get 32%. But we're looking at something, it's not implausible the Tories get half that. That's not going to happen. But it's not implausible the Tories get half that on July the 4th. They could get 20% around margin of error, up or down. Did you ever think that was possible, say, in 2021 or 2022?
I think if you had read what I wrote at the time, I think it was my analysis that it was finished by then. Because for various reasons, one was the economic model of Brexit, which Johnson promoted, couldn't work, that deal. Secondly, he was so corrupt in terms of his dealings in the public sphere. He corrupted the institutions of the British state, and it was becoming unworkable. This led, first of all, to the defenestration of Johnson after he lied to the House. A lot of people lie, but it was so well documented that it was set out and the Commons voted on it and established that a British Prime Minister had lied. It was obvious what was happening there, and eventually he had. Even the Tory party realised that he had to go. And then you got this series of inept prime ministers, two inept, terrible prime ministers, one after another. So I think it was all inevitable from about 2021 onwards, if it wasn't already, because as I say, the damage done when Johnson, and I don't think no political writer writes it because nowadays, political writers don't describe politics. They are part of factions. And they're client journalists, generally speaking, there to express the point of view of the people in power. So with Johnson in power at apparently his heyday, political journalism became a sort of form of decoration. And so you didn't get serious political journalism or analysis in the Conservative papers. And so the fact that the party had split in 2019, and then it had embarked on it was now then led by a leader who was actually smashing up the party quite deliberately, wasn't reported. In fact, Johnson was hailed as some sort of great man. And it is true that the Conservative papers, there was a problem. You couldn't read this anywhere because The Guardian was inept. Its political reporting was incapable, didn't really understand what was happening. All the papers had backed Johnson to be Tory leader, all the right-wing papers, Murdoch, Rothermere, Express, and the Telegraph, they'd all backed him to be leader. They then all backed him in the 2019 election. They all backed him as he got into trouble. And then they were still backing him the day he was kicked out of Parliament, kicked out as he lost that key vote and forced to leave. So the Tory papers had returned my colleagues in the political press had transformed themselves from sensible people trying to understand how power worked and what was being done with it as being propagandists for a particular wing of the Conservative Party, which it was already obvious at that point wasn't conservative. There's nothing conservative about Johnson at all. He didn't understand why institutions matter. That's a conservative idea. He didn't understand or hated even due process. He was hostile to the civil service, which is the memory of the British state, really, and he didn't like that. And he was very hostile to the rule of law. He exploited the monarchy, quite extraordinary in a conservative, to the light of the Queen. I mean, quite an extraordinary thing to do. And so we had it wasn't a conservative government, it was a revolutionary government, which was trying to smash the British state. It was doing what Lenin might have wanted to do. That's what it was doing. And cheered on by the so-called Tory press. It was a weird period. And by that, once you saw all that happening, it was clear the whole enterprise was doomed. And the party was doomed by then, yeah.
It's interesting, and there are arguable parallels with what's going on in Labour now. I'm not suggesting for one moment that Labour is heading for these kinds of polling numbers in several years, if ever. I'm not suggesting that for a moment. But this idea that actually the timeline we're now in was discernible from the summer of 2019 and the early years of the Johnson government, but there simply wasn't the space within the British media landscape to have the conversations about where this might end. I mean, I do see certain parallels potentially with Labour and Starmer because, for the reasons you've said, the people that should be passing political analysis are in fact just representing a particular faction which is favourable and aligned with the leadership. There's a book coming out from a gentleman called Simon Cooper. I've probably mispronounced that because I think it's a Dutch name, Flemish name. And it's about the demise of the good chaps theory of state.
Yes, I'm aware. I was reading a review of it today and it made a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. And he wrote an article in the FT Weekend last weekend. And he said that, the British state, and I think basically this aligns with your argument just a moment ago, effectively British conservatism, in the post-war period, in the democratic period, is really built on a public sphere of public duty, common sense, decency, which is really an outgrowth of the Second World War, mass mobilization of people into the military and so on, a collective memory of trauma. Can the Conservative Party rediscover that good chaps theory of government? Or is that just simply now, you said you don't see the personnel at the top of the party, but in 5, 10, 15 years, could it come back? Or is it?
Yeah, I read a review of it and I thought it made it, I agreed with the analysis, some of the analysis in the review. I think that his timelines were wrong. Actually, he makes out that the good chaps theory starts in I think the mid 20th century. It starts way before that. It's developed by, oddly enough, really the good chaps idea, which is that people are honest. That's what it means. You can trust them. It begins really in the mid 19th century under Gladstone's long period as Chancellor, when Palmerston was Prime Minister. And two great civil servants, Northcote Trevelyan, created the modern civil service, which was based on honour and decency. This is what Cooper was talking about in his book, or is talking about, which I think looks terrific to me. And they brought in this idea that what had happened in the 18th century, as described brilliantly by Namier in The Structure of Politics at the accession of George III, that's a masterclass in how politics actually works. He showed that everybody who went into British politics in the 18th century was basically out to make money. And that was what they looked at. It was very weird any other reason. And you can see this happens across a lot of the world. And then thanks to, I think, the power of evangelical Christianity, huge factor in Gladstone's understanding of the world, but also industrial competition. States which are bent find it very hard to compete. So much money is funneled off. So if you look at the reason why the two countries which went straight, as it were, adopted codes of public honesty in the late 19th century were Britain and Germany, and they were emerging as the two major global powers at that point. And so that is where you get that code, and the Conservative Party internalises it. And the old Whigs, the old aristocracy, which, and their voices like Trollope, the novelist, who were hostile to the new arrangement and wanted everything to be fixed in favour of an elite, they were gradually marginalised. And the Conservative Party, with a few bumps along the way, became the most public voice of that. But the Labour Party accepted it. And probably there's another wisdom about the Conservative Party. It also understood that it was unhealthy that it should rule all the time. And so you get this underappreciated premier called Baldwin in the 20s, who understands very quickly that you have to bring the organised working class into politics. And he is really the midwife to the rise of the Labour Party. And he dedicates his political career. Modern historians, I think, mock him for being boring, but that's only because they aren't interested in what he actually did. He dedicates his political career to fending off the far right and the far left. He's terrified of Bolshevism. This is just after 1917. And he's terrified of fascism. We got the rise of Hitler and Mussolini. And what he does then is to bring in Labour as a mainstream political party, approved as part of British high establishment. And then, of course, when Labour fails temporarily splits in 1931, he sort of rescues it, actually, with MacDonald. And then he sees off, or he doesn't allow the fascist elements, which are always there under the surface in Britain, to seize the Tory party in the 1930s. He gets a rotten press, partly because Churchill hated him wrongly. I mean, he gets a rotten press, but that is the embodiment of the wisdom of conservatism. And that's what we've totally lost. Because the current generation of conservative leaders do not understand what Baldwin was on about. And so you get idiots like Sunak. I mean, very sinister people, actually, like Sunak, who go, you see, it's one of the most frightening things which happened in British politics ever was Sunak's trip, totally unreported as far as I can tell by the client press, to visit Maloney for a political event just before Christmas last year, where they're spouting the Great Replacement theory. I mean, this is very dark stuff. And you saw, obviously, he's still getting on with Maloney. Look at that sort of extraordinary meeting they had just a few days ago. And so you get a Conservative Party which now is now driven by weird strategists, I think, who just think of where do we get the next vote and not what do we stand for.
This is interesting on the point of strategy, because the person who's apparently leading this so-called non-strategy by the looks of it, but alleged strategy, Isaac Levido, is a protege of Linton Crosby.
Yeah.
But there doesn't feel to be any continuity with the professionalism of their campaigns of yesteryear. So I can understand your point of they think in tactics, not strategy, i.e. short-term responsive thinking rather than long-term, 10, 15 years, what are we doing, what are we for? But that doesn't necessarily explain the amateurishness of it, or does it?
Well, I think it is almost impossible to exaggerate the damage Linton Crosby, who was a very suave, intelligent person, has done to Britain via the Conservative Party. Because I think you'll find, if you look into Linton, very underexplored figure, because here's a rule of British political journalism. Anybody who's genuinely important never gets written about because he or she is too dangerous to inspect. And so I'd love to know more about who was financing Linton's campaigns. He ran Johnson's No Deal strategy. He was behind that hard Brexit we had, and it was just getting rid of Mrs. May. That was very much with the help of the very able strategist of Linton, who, by the way, is a very civilized person. I know him. I mean, whereas Isaac Levideau, it's a bit like Isaac Levideau to Linton. It's a bit like, should we say, Tom Baldwin to Alistair Campbell, a sort of minor version, a sort of
mini-me.
Mini-me, yes. And I think that's what you got going on. I think clearly Levideau, there's been anxious briefing from people close to Levideau, I'm told, that he was against this date for an election. But nevertheless, to bring in these very crude, divisive politics, the so-called culture wars, as a way to try and rescue the situation for the Conservatives, has done enormous damage to Britain. This is the other thing which is upsetting. It is the duty of a statesman, who aspires to high office, to bring the country together. But Conservative Party, under the wedge politics kind of adopted by Linton, which he'd already tried out, as you know, in Australia, with great success, these wedge strategies about creating divisions where none previously existed. And I can see they have been the Linton-Crosby strategies have been politically very successful, and he's also known how to avoid losers. But they've been to us as a nation, in my view, they've been a total calamity.
I've only ever received letters threatening civil action as a result of alleged defamation twice. One was from Majid Nawaz when I mistakenly called him a terrorist. I meant a former terrorist. I meant former extremist. He was correct. I apologized. I paid the expense of the letter. Fine. And I was in the wrong. That's fine. I should have been more thoughtful in my words. Another time, the only other time, was Linton Crosby when I said that he had traded in, I think, Islamophobic tropes in the Canadian election when they were campaigning against Trudeau. And on that occasion, I had used my words very carefully. And what was interesting is, I think about a week or two subsequent to that tweet, I got an email and a letter saying, this is defamatory, please delete, make an apology, blah, 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 blah. And I said, I see, there's no problem here. If you want to take this any further, please be my guest. And they never did. But I got the sense that I was dealing with very professional, serious people.
No, I think he is, as I say, I do think he has been the most accomplished political strategist of our age. I just think he's done a lot of harm while he's been doing it.
But the point you've said about people don't write about the individuals that matter. I mean, that really is so true. I think the minute I've even said a tweet about him, which is in no way defamatory, I think can be held up very clearly. Even that got an email and letter. I wonder how often that happens. But anyway, I suppose the counter argument to this is, well, if you look at the polling right now, yes, the Tories are doing very poorly, let's say 19, 20%, depending which day it is. But Reform are doing very well. And if you look at where the Tory votes are going, some are staying at home, some are going Labour. But the largest number of people who are no longer voting Tory, who did in 2019, are going to Reform. Doesn't that fly in the face of your analysis that actually dealing in the culture wars isn't advantageous? Somebody like Farage would say, actually, they're not doing it properly. They're not serious enough about ending net zero, about being hard on migration. And actually, your read on it is the wrong one. What would you say to that?
I don't think that Farage is playing culture wars. I think he's deadly serious. I mean, I think that the people who advised Linton, who advised the Conservative Party, was to use them in order to, as an election gambit. I think that, and I was slow to realise this, I think you can see now that Farage and the Reform Party are a prototype. I think you've got to be very careful to use about the word fascist because it has certain meanings, above all the use of political violence in the street and also unhelpful comparisons with the 1930s. But nevertheless, what you have here is Farage is you can connect him to a group of European movements. I think that's he's part of a conservative movement, not a party, including Le Pen and Orbán and the AfD and so on. And what they're really doing, fundamentally is running the Great Replacement theory, which was a book by a French far-right intellectual about 12 years ago, wasn't it? And it means Western culture is under threat, Western civilization, our life under threat from these sinister immigrants who've come to, challenge our way of life. It preys on fears which people have. And again, the job of a proper politician, a responsible politician, looked like Edward Heath in 1968 when he sacked Enoch Powell. Enoch Powell was a prototype for Farage. Very sinister, openly racist. And the Conservative Party in 1968 dealt with Farage, dealt with Powell. Farage openly admires Powell. And so you've got the return of Powell through another means with his Reform Party, which is, if you look at the tweets, we're learning more and more every day about the Reform Party and the bigotry and racism. It's horrible. And yet, have you heard a squeak from Sunak? A proper British Prime Minister would have denounced Farage by now and said, this is unacceptable. Our country will never wear this. This is un-British. Farage was even claiming to be British, British values. So this is the opposite of the great multicultural traditions, welcoming of immigrants and decency, which our country stands for and always has stood for. That's what Heath did, in effect, in 1968 when he killed off Enoch Powell's career overnight. And Starmer's been pathetic. I'm really shocked that the incoming Labour leader hasn't made a speech saying this is revolting. It has to be fought. This is the battle of our lifetime. Look what's happening in France. Look what's happening in Germany. It's not going to happen in my Britain. And he'd single out Farage, the unacceptable face of British politics. You've had nothing from either Starmer or Sunak in this general election. Nothing I've seen anyway. Have you?
Well, I think Starmer was asked today about Farage, and I think he basically gave no comment.
He said no comment, right?
Focusing on the election and the issues that matter to people.
And have you noticed the coverage in the political papers? And so they're all playing, leaving aside the Guardian, they're playing with him. The Telegraph pretty well backing him, almost deranged political commentary from the Telegraph, pretty well backing him. Spectator on the week that he came back as leader of Reform, had 4 articles about Farage. Not one of them criticised his Islamophobia, his easy tolerance of racists, his bigotry. Not one. Charles Moore, Douglas Murray. I'm talking memories. In this week's Spectator, you've got Toby Young endorsing Farage in The Spectator. Now, The Spectator is, somebody called it the Bible of the Conservative movement. And so they really do. They want this merger, don't they, with the far right. It's like the National Front merging with the Conservative Party. It's horrible. And it's exactly the opposite of what the founding fathers of conservatism were about. You remember Edmund Burke, they all praise Edmund Burke. What was his career founded on? But, he was attacking the bigotry of the British Empire. The Warren Hastings case. He was standing up for the rights of, people who weren't just exploitative Brits. He had a wide, generous moral compass. This narrow sectarian, bordering on white supremacism sometimes, we're now getting from the far right from the mainstream Conservative Party and Reform is an extraordinary moment.
So there's that big historical sweep, which I love, by the way, talking about, the incentives for people entering politics in 18th century Britain, talking about Burke and Oakeshott. And I can see all of that. And I can see this huge deviation from its historical origins that's now taking place in British conservatism. But to anchor it in 2024, is it possible even for the Conservatives to dismiss Farage like Heath did in 68 with Enoch Powell? Because, they're polling, it's one poll had them ahead of the Tories. They're looking at winning several seats. Farage has an incredible presence in the media, incredible, far more than Powell ever did. And I just wonder, I appreciate that's the historical analogy, but it feels like we're seeing something an order of magnitude bigger. And so as a political challenge for Starmer too, doesn't that make it a little bit different? Or am I buying the Kool-Aid with Farage?
I think one of the problems, I again return to the nature of contemporary political discourse, is that it's about sort of narrow arguments about strategic advantage and how do we get these votes and so on. It's not about looking ahead or actually asking what do we stand for, what are our actual values. And that is, to my mind, much more important. And if you go back to, I've talked about Baldwin, I was talking about Edward Heath, talking about the early creators of the Tory party, like Peel. I mean, they're really people who put their careers on the line for major issues. So I can see that strategically there is this argument now coming from two different places. One is from these strategists, these invisible creatures inside political parties, who are saying, look, if we're going to get more votes at the election, we need to form an alliance with Reform. Yeah? And then you get the ideologists who now want to move the Conservative Party away from being this broad church, which has, broadly speaking, existed for nearly 200 years, to being a movement, a conservative movement, with friendships and common purpose with the far right in Europe.
But I mean,
to me, it seems you may be right that actually. And my fear is that after the general, so let's move on to in a few weeks' time, right? You've got 100 seats or something, maybe less, and there's a battle, but for who's going to be the next Tory leader. It may take several years because you will see probably Suella Braverman will emerge as the leading candidate for the great replacement theory, as it were. And you'll find that there'll be somebody, maybe Penny Mordaunt or Hunt, where he survive electorally, and there'll be a little battle, and that battle is very important because it's a battle for the title deeds of the Conservative Party. Effectively, the Conservative Party has gone in terms of its deep roots in civil society, up and down Britain, Scotland, the North, manufacturing industry, agriculture. It really doesn't exist in a serious way anymore. But it still exists in our history. This has been the eminent party of government for 200 years. It's still got the name, and it's still got the legal structure. The danger is that after the 4th or 5th of July, you're going to get a far-right movement led by, let's take as an example, Braverman, seizing control of the Conservative Party, which has no real connection with conservatism as we've known it for the last 200 years. It will be the equivalent of Marine Le Pen's party or someone. And it'll delude the voters. So for most people very sensibly take little interest in politics, they won't know that the party has... they're canvassing under a conservative name is really somebody deeply unpleasant with foul views, which can trend towards fascism in due course. I mean, you remember, fascism doesn't knock on your door saying we're fascists. They say we're nice people who share your concerns.
You said that they've got no anchor in society, this modern conservative movement. And I mean, that's inarguable. I've been going to places like Godalming or Fareham or Wickham or small town or large town, Conservative seats, the so-called blue wall across the south. And it's very clear to me that the Conservative Party has collapsed. Even the people who are still planning to vote for them they now hate the Conservative Party because they're not right-wing enough or because they've just not executed very well in office. People will say, my DNA is effectively Conservative. I will vote for the Conservative Party even if they get 0 seats. Those people actually dislike the party more than anyone in some cases. There's nothing worse than a disappointed romantic. And I think many of them felt quite eager about the Conservative Party, relatively recently, whether that's Thatcher or whether it was Brexit. And that's obvious to me. And again, the relationship of the Conservative Party to the institutions of British civil society, the National Trust, RNLI, RSPB. I mean, it's astonishing the Tory party goes to war with the National Trust.
It's amazing. I'm led by the... I've also noticed, it's quite fascinating, if you read the Daily Telegraph, which I do with a growing sense of amazement, it also attacks the middle classes.
Yeah.
There's a category of people called middle-class Remainers, which the Telegraph has really got it in for. I mean, they actually hate their own readers. It's an extraordinary thing. And and they're attacking, and they're running a campaign against the National Trust. Where are we? Yeah. It's and that is, I think, and you can see their flirtation, you see, with reform, and that's really serious.
But the part of civil society where they do still have roots is what you just said there, which is the media. So that's the part of conservative, let's say small c conservative British civil society, where there is still that connection with the party, the large C Conservative Party. And you're somebody who's obviously been in that world. You were chief political commentator for The Telegraph. You were political editor for The Spectator. You criticised both outlets a few moments ago. Have they changed?
Yeah, I'll explain.
Or have you changed?
I'll explain what has happened. And I would argue that I haven't changed very much. More or less, I stand for exactly the same thing, which I did when I was a political columnist. We had nothing as vulgar as political editors in those days. They were called political correspondent, because a political editor edits nothing at all. He writes. It's just a sort of inflated, non-meaningless phrase to make people appear grander than they really are. But I would argue that I was, when I was at The Spectator, my values were exactly the same as now. I believed in the rule of law, trashed by the Conservative Party. I was a strong monarchist, still am, mocked Michael Gove. He even leaked Privy Council conversations with Queen Elizabeth. And so on. They have been captured. All of these groups, the Conservative Party, but also the newspapers, have been captured by the super rich. It's very horrible. There was a connection between the Times, the Telegraph, only a generation ago, the Daily Mail, with civil society, with its readers. And it did represent them. The paper, if you look at the ownership of the papers now, Murdoch was the precursor of this, who's never been British as far as I know, and how much British taxes does he pay? It doesn't really you've got to ask whose interests are at heart. Does he have at heart? And the Telegraph is getting odder and odder under the ownership of the Barclay brothers, actually attacking its own readers. And I tend to see these newspapers having fallen under the control of a small group of very rich men. I can't see any women involved in this process, who have their own reasons for wanting to own newspapers, namely to exercise political control, achieve their ends. And 30 million or 40 million on a media outlet can actually be a very good investment if you can change policy in the direction you want it.
I think that's true, and it's not new, but I agree that it's clearly intensified since, let's say, the early 2000s. But I mean, you were at the Telegraph when the Barclay brothers were there, and also when they had the Spectator. That's an amazing story, by the way. It's like Succession now. You've got the kids fighting over the scraps. And a crazy story. You were there then. Was it obvious to you then, or did it take you a...
It was, because I resigned from the Telegraph.
Sure, but were you happy for a period under them, or did you see it getting worse? Or because obviously, Murdoch comes to the UK, I think, in '69 with News of the World.
Yeah, Murdoch, yes.
By the Times in the 80s. It's not a wholly new phenomenon.
Yeah, and also, I think that you have to trace the history of this. Murdoch became super powerful under Blair. Thatcher kept him at arm's length. And in my view, for instance, she went down to the Sun once, I think, talked to once, I think. And this decision by the Blair government, incoming Blair government in 1997, to fly all the way to Queensland and sort of pay obeisance, basically, doff their cap to Murdoch in 96, I think it was, attending a meeting of News Corps in crazy. And then if you look at the period after that, the unlimited access given to Murdoch executives in Downing Street, or Murdoch whenever he wanted to go, this created a new kind of politics. I document quite a lot of it in my book on Alistair Campbell, by the way, and it was new. John Major had not tolerated this, and that's one of the reasons they set out destroying him, I suspect, because he wouldn't play their game. And so you got something very new with Blair, which was then, of course, adopted by Cameron, and I can explain to you how that happened too. Which was something very new emerges, where the Parliament is effectively replaced by the media in 1997. The conventional role played by Parliament, i.e. where announcements are made on the floor of the House. They go to the front page of the Sun rather than made in the Commons, and a series of pathetic speakers have allowed that to happen. The government is accountable to the papers more than to their own MPs, who. The figure at this moment in history of the chief whip is massively diminished. If you look back to those early TV dramas about politics, the big man is the chief whip. Suddenly, the big man becomes the press guy, the Alistair Campbell, or whoever it is. Now, that becomes the new model of it. They are taken into government. Suddenly you get the press, the editors sitting alongside cabinet. A fantastic moment in early New Labour, when, what's her name? Rebecca Brooks, I think. She's the editor of the Sun. She sits next to the cabinet in party conference speeches. She doesn't sit with the journalists. She's brought inside. And the News International parties become sort of must attend. Obviously, Cameron, to do him justice, tried to resist this. When he first appeared, but it led to political disaster. He had an emergency moment in 2007 when his poll rankings collapsed, and he solves it by bringing in Coulson, the former editor of the News of the World, as his press advisor, and that changes everything. But he constructs policy in order to please the Murdoch press, rather than to do the conservative thing. I mean, one classic example of this is treatment of Muslims. Policy towards Muslims until 2007 was, you just look at what Cameron was saying and doing. He was saying we shouldn't use words like Islamism. We should treat the Muslim community with great respect. Saeed Avasi was made a cabinet minister, a shadow cabinet minister, and then suddenly you get Coulson, and it gets harder. You get Murdoch. I don't want to attribute him. Coulson is the symbol of all this. It's done for Murdoch, and they start to turn on minorities. Gove is given control, and Michael Gove, who's a very interesting phenomenon. Gove, he's absolute disaster from start to finish as a cabinet minister, but he always gets written up as absolutely brilliant. When you saw the political obituaries written him, he was the minister for Murdoch, right? That's all he was really, and so he can't do anything wrong. You're just written up as a genius, because whatever he does is regarded with enormous acclaim. And so that is what happened. A new structure was created for British politics and the relationship with the media. And again, I return to Baldwin. They tried it out in early 1930s. When the big media guys, Beaverbrook, tried basically to take over politics, and Baldwin made this, and they formed a new political party and tried to run against the Conservative Party, and Baldwin made his famous speech, power without responsibility is the prerogative of the harlot. That famous speech, and he said, "Clear out, get out of the way." Another reason why Churchill hated Baldwin, because of course Beaverbrook was his mate. But it was a massive moment, And Cameron could have done that. It's fascinating. And you look at missed opportunities in modern politics after the phone hacking. He could have used that to really take on Murdoch, but instead of which he did that, well, the Tory party did that deal, and, there was never Leveson 2, and obviously they had to respond to the public outrage at, Millie Dowler, but it was sorted through backstairs dealings with the big proprietors.
That's interesting, a genealogy of Tory collapse. And, that alternative timeline of, like you say, the phone hacking inquiry and Cameron maybe not hiring Coulson. I mean, I think that's quite an alluring argument. The point around Murdoch and Gove, maybe my memory doesn't serve me, but I think I'm correct in saying that the first interview with Trump after he became the president was in the Times, conducted by Michael Gove, who's a British politician. He used to be a journalist, but he's
and with Murdoch in the room. Yeah.
Precisely. And I think that was one of those moments where I thought, what on earth is going on?
Exactly. And that was a big moment. We're talking about the movement away from conventional conservatism, Burkean conservatism, to this new, very populist, dangerous white supremacist conservatism. I'm trying to be very careful with my language. The conservatism of Donald Trump. And Murdoch, of course, was, through Fox News, was a massive figure in bringing about Trump in 2016. And nobody ever could say, all these pompous people who write for the Times, it's not an issue for them. All these, these worthy journalists who express these important thoughts on the column op-eds and so on.
Have you lost friends saying the things that you've said? Because obviously, like I said, this is your former employer with the Telegraph and with the Spectator. There must be many people who think, Peter, you've got this completely wrong. This is just how ideas and parties and politics develop. Things change, people change, and you're not responding to the times changing.
Yeah, well, I have lost a few friends, yeah. But I got some, there are friends and friends, aren't there? I mean, one other point about the media world, right, basically there aren't any friendships. They're all scratching each other's back, aren't they? Telling each other how wonderful, what a wonderful column you've just written, darling. This is the media world, yeah? And that's how it operates. And then if you fall out of favour, you're dumped. It's brutal. Politics has got a bit too much like that too. And so you've got to bear in mind there aren't any friends. It's about, in the end of the day. And so, because also there's this unspoken agreement, which I really find, it really annoys me. It did do right from the start, that you would never criticise one of your colleagues. There was a sort of standoff, wasn't there? No paper would ever criticise another paper, and no journalist would ever expose the rotten practices of his or her colleague. And that continues. And so, again, that's when they all came together on phone hacking. It's a massive criminal conspiracy at the heart of Fleet Street. They all joined together. And then when Alan Rusbridger went, the new editor, whoever the editor was, obviously they just laid it alone. Obviously the Guardian decided, for whatever reason, it was going to leave that alone after Nick Davies and Alan Rusbridger went. And all the other groups all came together, to protect Murdoch, as the Guardian, I'm afraid.
So you've spoken highly of Rusbridger. Nick Davies, phenomenal. So what do you make of his replacement, Kath Viner? You don't sound particularly positive. Because this is the paper that the left looks to.
Well, what is tragic about, I don't know whose decision it was, but as editor, I would have thought you had some role in it, is to just not to leave phone hacking alone as a subject of interest. And, it's not gone away. If you've been reading Nick, there's this, if you read Prospect under Alan Rusbridger, Nick Davies.
He's made it worth reading.
He really has. And it was a very interesting piece of journalism written by Alan Rusbridger the other day. And it was he read Nadine Dorries' book. Now, I haven't read that. I don't suppose you have.
I saw it in a charity shop on Saturday, anyway, but that's a different question.
But it contained one nugget of information from Nadine Dorries about the appointment of the next BBC, or was it the Ofcom chair, and some skullduggery, something irregular had happened inside Downing Street. And Alan Rusbridger just said, right, did this happen? And he went on this quest. And it's the almost perfect piece of political journalism because, he gets fobbed off. And gradually a picture emerges of how Britain has been run under the Conservatives, and it involves somebody called Sir Robbie Gibb, who's a governor of the BBC. I used to know him as a sort of rather indifferent producer. And he's now a governor in the BBC who established in charge of bias. Now, and this whole world, there's somebody else called Dougie Smith. You've never heard of Dougie Smith, nobody probably. But Dougie Smith he basically makes all the decisions about patronage. He hasn't even got apparently a role in government. Now, what he exposed is this extraordinary world which we now live in and have been living in for the last 5 years, ever since Johnson became Prime Minister. And of course, none of this would ever get written about in the Times or the Telegraph or the Mail. It's just you have to get, and the Guardian has given up the ghost in this sort of stuff. It doesn't want to touch media because the stories are so harrowing, and so you really have to go to sort of non-mainstream media to understand what's happening in this country.
You've said the Guardian doesn't want to go near media stories. You said earlier that the Guardian's political reporting, its political desk isn't very good. I wholly agree. I think it's appalling.
It's got a bit better lately. Pippa Crerar has made an improvement.
That's true. And I'm thinking really over the last
No, but there was a long period when they have made no effort to expose the Tory scandals.
No.
And I couldn't understand why not. That's what they should have been. Pippa Crerar, who, of course, played a major role at the Mirror. She was excellent at the Mirror and had gone to the Guardian. She has improved things a lot.
I buy that, but I suppose the question is, you're saying that the Guardian, and we're not putting the boot in the Guardian, but the point, I'm
just saying it should have been so much better.
Well, here's the thing. So you're saying that there's this big rightward shift in the whole of the British media. You've got this one outlier, which is the Guardian, and yet you're saying on the media, on the phone hacking, on the political reporting, it's been quite weak. And I just wonder, why is that?
Look, I never worked for the Guardian. I do occasional op-ed columns for them, but that's probably the last time I'm ever going to do that.
I'm sure.
But I don't know how it works. I can't give you any insight into the innards of the Guardian.
I just wonder about the whole, like you said, the media culture of a sort of fait accompli, where people don't scrutinise or hold one another to account, and that clearly goes beyond political ideology. Or maybe there are just very high costs. There are very high costs for the Guardian to, quote, go to war with the Telegraph, the Spectator, the Times.
I don't know. This is all speculation. What does worry me, looking ahead, because I was around when Tony Blair became Prime Minister, and basically the media went on strike, all of it. I mean, you couldn't write a negative word about Tony Blair for about 5 years until the Iraq War. It was very, very hard.
So when was it, what are these dates are, like 96?
97 to 2002.
Right.
Well,
okay.
When he was in power, and actually a little bit before, because the writing was on the wall that he was going to get it. And I hope that we don't go into a period of media sycophancy towards Starmer. I suspect that we will, but we also, I still remember, and I'm scarred by the sycophancy towards Johnson for so long as Prime Minister.
Is it possible that the Liberal Democrats just become the sort of the centre-right party? Like people like Cameron, we've obviously criticised Cameron, but there was a Cameron prior to 2007 who's more in line with the kinds of conservatism you're talking about. Rory Stewart, for instance. Could they become that sort of centre-right party?
I don't think so. I think Cameron's busted. I think
Rory Stewart?
I think he's got this very unhealthy relationship with Alistair Campbell. I wish it wasn't so. He's rather overwhelmed in those conversations. It's very bad for Rory, and I think he was one of the most interesting figures in modern conservative political history. I thought he was a fantastic cabinet minister, very wise and sensible.
So there's no realignment where you see sort of Labour on the centre, Lib Dems on the centre-right, and they're the opposition party.
I think it's too early to see what lies ahead for the Lib Dems. their historical role. I don't think they don't know what they stand for, really. At the moment, it appears a series of empty stunts which are much praised in the political press. But apart from that...
Final question. You've just said this is an era-defining election. I mean, people always say that about elections, but I think that's absolutely true with this one. When was the last time we had a general election as momentous as the one we're facing on July the 4th, 2024?
It's much more extraordinary. All that 1997 did was to reaffirm the Thatcher consensus. So it wasn't really a very important. 1978-9, that was important. It was it ushered in the era of neoliberalism. I think this election reminds me of 29. You have a new Labour leader coming in. It was Ramsay MacDonald then. And why I say 29, the Ramsay MacDonald, no fault of his, faced a double problem, one of which was immense geopolitical instability, and secondly, economic collapse, again, which started in the United States. And that economic collapse forced a split in his party. And he was rescued by Mr. Baldwin, who sort of basically ran his government for him for a while and then took over. But I think that Starmer, because he has not had the courage, or that he's been too strategic, he could have won this election with a fantastic manifesto to challenge the omerta imposed by the mainstream press. He could have taken on Murdoch. He could have said, we're going to have a commission to look at how Brexit's gone. That's what he should have done. We're going to have a big commission and see what we should do. Momentous step taken by this country. How long ago? Almost 10 years ago. We're going to and taken on powerful interests, instead of which he's played grandmother's footsteps. He's not really he's sort of been so safe. And also he said, we stand for, he should have really powerful speeches about the far right, about Islamophobia and so on. But he hasn't. He's just trying to offend as few people as possible. So he won't have a mandate to govern. And so every time he does something serious, he'll be accused of, he has the majority, but not the mandate. He'll be accused of betrayal and lying. And of course, we know how he won the Labour leadership through a whole pack of lies about what he stood for. And then he actually fought the manifesto on the opposite. I mean, literally the opposite of what he told the Labour members 5 years ago. His fight. And then I dare say in government, he'll try and retrace his steps, but he's not going to have a lot of automatic support. He's not made the arguments, for why the Labour government is necessary. And that's, I think, an awful pity, and he'll come to regret it.
Peter Oborne, thanks for joining us here on Novara Media.
Thank you very much.